All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today I'm joined by ESPN's Mike Rothstein. We're going to be talking about Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith's combine press conferences, as well as the many moves that the Falcons may make this offseason.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong on Twitter, at FalcFans, and, of course, the host of this world-renowned Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I want to thank everyone out there that makes Locked On Falcons their first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons can be found on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, as well as on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel and give us a like when you do. Today, I'm joined by Mike Rothstein of ESPN, making, I believe, his third appearance on the podcast. And
something like that, my man. I would say you got your intro down.
Well, when you do a podcast 5 days a week, you get used to it. Although a couple of weeks ago, I completely blanked on it, and I was like, I've done this intro like 100 times, and I don't know why I just completely blanked on it. But yeah, man, Mike's on with us to talk a little bit about the Falcons' offseason plans and strategies. We'll talk a little bit about the Tuesday pressers that Arthur Smith and Terry Fontenot did at the Combine, their first press conferences at the Combine, because obviously last year no one was attending the Combine. So I guess, Mike, my question is, was this sort of the typical Arthur and Terry say a lot but not really say anything type of press conference, or did you learn anything, glean anything from anything that they said?
On the whole, it felt like I'm gonna call it a nothing burger. In just that there was nothing new that was said, really. Yes, we know they have cap constraints. Yes, we know they're gonna have to make some moves by trade, release, restructure to get cap space and then fill out their roster. Yes, we know they're going to be patient. I did think it was interesting that Terry Fontenot basically all but said they're not going to make a splash signing in free agency, which not surprising considering the fact that they right now are over the cap. But that to me signals that I don't expect to see a massive kind of wholesale, okay, all of these guys are moving type scenario that some people, myself included, have thought may happen. Because I think if you saw that, which means, and just to be clear, like trading Grady Jarrett, trading Calvin Ridley, moving on from other guys, finding a trade partner for Deion Jones, like all of these, like the complete rebuild scenario, that's clearly not happening. In a very cliche answer, Terry Fontenot said when he was asked about, or when he was talking rather about like whether they're rebuilding or they're trying to win now, said he wants to have his cake and eat it too. That's very, obviously cliche, but that was one thing that stuck out to me in terms of that's been their mantra from the start, was they're not going to be in a full rebuild. And listen, you can call it whatever you want, but you are in some level of rebuilding, and they're not admitting that. But they're also not going to go the complete where we're not going to be competitive situation, which you've seen some other teams do, including Detroit right now. Miami tried that a few years ago. That, some Cleveland was doing it for a while. That sometimes leads to success, sometimes doesn't. So I don't think we're going to see that, at least not intentionally, from the Falcons.
Yeah, I thought that was probably the most interesting thing that Terry Fontenot said, where it just kind of feels like, when you heard some of the rhetoric that they said last offseason, depending on the context, it did sound like they were ready to compete right away or whatever the case may be. And a lot of that was probably just, the typical, that's the things you have to say in order to get the fans to buy in and sell those PSLs and all those various things. But it was interesting to me to sort of see him basically say, that kind of straddle the fence strategy of like, we're trying to be as competitive as possible as we can be, but at the same time, we do have an eye towards sort of the long-term future. So they're not necessarily going all in, but they're also not necessarily doing the tear down and rebuild. And so we'll see how they sort of straddle that fence as we move forward, as we talk with Mike Rothstein about the Falcons offseason moves. And he talked about how the Falcons may not be big spenders in free agency, but there are many ways in which they can create cap space to be somewhat spenders, I guess we could call it, in free agency. And we'll talk about that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, even though it's combine time and it's the height of the offseason in the NFL, basketball season is in full steam, whether you're talking pro or college hoops. And betonline.net is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. And whether it's basketball, football, hockey, boxing, UFC, all the way to your favorite Vegas casino games, BetOnline is the best spot for all your sports scores, podcast news, odds, total, player props. You know they're going to have some great draft props when we get to April. So go to betonline.net today. Use your mobile device to sign up as well. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, Mike, Steve Weish of NFL Network had some interesting comments the other day about ways in which the Falcons can create cap space. And I think, there's been a lot of conversation and debate about which ways that the Falcons would utilize that. Weish sort of pointed out about potential contract extensions for guys like Grady Jarrett, Jake Matthews, talked about not necessarily the Falcons wanting to restructure or extend Matt Ryan's contract. You've already mentioned potential trades of Calvin Ridley and Deion Jones as other ways. What are your thoughts on the many ways that the Falcons may be able to create cap space, and what are sort of the expectations that you have that they may do that over the next 2 weeks?
Yeah, first, Deion Jones, I don't know how movable that contract is. You got to find a buyer there, and with guaranteed money on the table, I don't see that happening. As of right now, I just don't. I think that contract is a tough contract to move. And I think they like Deion Jones. And do you remember Deion Jones? And we talked about it, I think, the last time I was on, or I talked about it on my podcast from the Perch, that Deion Jones was learning a new position last year, and I think a lot of people did not necessarily understand that. And beyond that, didn't know totally, because where he lined up was very similar, at least in a 3-4, to being an inside middle linebacker type situation. And that's not exactly the role he was playing. So I'm curious to see what they do with Deion Jones. But to me, I think the Calvin Ridley situation is kind of the key to all of it, right? If you're keeping Calvin Ridley, then you need to create other ways, whether that's a Grady Jarrett extension, a Jake Matthews extension, moving on from some other players, because guys like, to me, Mike Davis and Tyler Davison are bigger contracts that can create space for you. But if you're trading Calvin Ridley, well, then you've at least gotten yourself into the positive in terms of cap space, but now you need a number one wide receiver, and maybe you get that through the draft, or you get that through, deciding to go mid-level in free agency, and then maybe try to bring back Russell Gage as well. Like there's all of these moving pieces, and I think so much of that somewhat hinges on Ridley. But if you can get extensions done with Jarrett and Matthews, then that's another way to create space. I do believe what Steve said, that I don't think you want to restructure Matt Ryan. I think you want to, because you don't want to carry, again, another massive cap hit in 2023. And if you restructure Matt Ryan, you're basically doing that, or you're adding voidable years, which is what I wrote about back in January, of that's a strategy to do it, where you're all of a sudden spreading that out in like 24, 25, maybe even 26, where it's lesser and the cap's going to go up, you think. So there's room to maneuver that you've created, but you don't want, if you can stomach and handle the cap hit, or do a small restructure maybe on Matt Ryan's contract to where it's not as bad, but I'm not a full restructure, then yeah, I think you get through it if you're the Falcons with that. Because listen, Arthur Blank's a very smart man. I think we all understand that. He's made billions of dollars in business. And him talking about a succession plan, which he did after the Super Bowl, or before the Super Bowl, and saying that they've been looking at it for years, he's not saying that accidentally. And Terry Fontenot was asked about it today, and he had said that, well, yeah, looking for succession plans at every position, which is true, but quarterback is the one that the succession plan is kind of the most important. Your succession plan at long snapper is not exactly as important, Yeah. I mean, And Josh Harris, by the way, right now a free agent. We'll see if he comes back. I would imagine, like, I'm that of all the free agents the Falcons have, that's the one I'm actually least concerned about maybe coming back, just because most long snappers are on 1-year deals, especially once you get to that age that Josh Harris is at. But all that, but it's going to take some tough decisions, whether that's moving on from guys or not. And I forget if it was in the presser or they did a side scrum with the reporters that were in Indianapolis. I'm not actually in Indianapolis right now, but one of the things that was said there is that, yeah, sometimes, if X, then Y, and I'm paraphrasing, when it comes to moves. And to me, that struck very specifically at maybe the Cordarrelle Patterson, Mike Davis situation, because I don't see both of them back in Atlanta next year. Could I see a scenario where neither one is back next year? Sure, I can see that scenario. But I think it could be an either-or situation. If Cordarrelle Patterson ends up returning, I think that might come at the expense of Mike Davis. If Cordarrelle Patterson doesn't return, well, Mike Davis's contract isn't that bad. It's not like they're giving him $9 million or something like that. That you can make an argument for, okay, we're going to keep this guy, have a rookie, the rookie can learn from Mike Davis and go from there. I can see a scenario where that happens. So that to me is that XY thing. Cordarrelle Patterson, by the way, I talked with him last weekend, and he goes on From the Perch podcast on Monday, and I wrote a story about it for ESPN.com on Monday, and he would like to return, and like he's still big on that. But as he told me, listen, I also have a family to make decisions for too. So I don't think if they came and were like, hey, we're going to sign you for like $1 million. I don't think, unless Patterson has no other offers, I don't think he's doing that. I think he's going to get offers, maybe see what's out there. But if the Falcons come with a good offer before free agency starts and he feels comfortable with it, I think he'll do it. It's just that type of balance and scenario. I think there are other positions that are similar where it's, if they bring back X, then maybe they move on from Y. But running back to me is the most obvious one that I think that is maybe what people are waiting on to kind of see what happens.
Yeah, I think those are some excellent points. And I listened to that episode that you did with Cordarrelle Patterson. Excellent episode. Recommend all the people go check it out to get some more insights into Cordarrelle Patterson and his Pokemon card collection.
Oh, I thought the dishes thing was hilarious. He's just like obsessed with doing dishes like that. I was like, oh man, I get it.
So I think you bring up an interesting point with the running back position, because I think you're right. It is kind of a potentially either or situation with Mike Davis and Cordarrelle Patterson. And there's reasons for the Falcons to want to keep Mike Davis. We know that throughout the season, they've really valued his ability in pass protection. And in a world where Cordarrelle Patterson walks in free agency and you bring in, say, a rookie in the draft, we know that rookie running backs aren't necessarily known for their pass protecting abilities. And so Mike Davis would certainly have value in that arena to help that rookie sort of transition a little bit better into the NFL without having that put on his plate. And what's interesting about what Terry Fontenot said at the Combine today, he talked about how Cordarrelle Patterson, the Falcons were kind of lucky because he was not getting the necessarily offers that he was hoping to get, and that's why he was still available a couple of weeks before the draft in April. But I think, as you say, like I don't know if he's going to have to be that patient with some of the offers coming off of the season that he has. And I certainly think the Falcons will probably be one of the teams at the front of the line to offer him a much more lucrative contract than he was getting offered apparently last year. So I do think we'll probably get some news early in the offseason about Cordarrelle Patterson because of that, 2-3 day tampering window where a lot of teams are, the deadline for when guys are trying to get guys re-signed so that they don't hit the market and then potentially lose them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. But also I would not be shocked if, because he's a running back and we've seen the running back market typically evolve slow in free agency, it would not shock me if he has to wait a little while to figure it out where teams are. And maybe he just says, you know what, like I like whatever offer the Falcons give me and I take it. It's going to be, I think this next week is going to be really interesting for really like 4 guys, right? And maybe we see some other guys, like I mentioned Josh Harris before, like some minimum guys, like vet main guys, like, maybe one of like a Steven Means or Brandon Copeland, or maybe I don't know. I'm trying to like think of a couple of other guys that are like vet min type situations that maybe come back because like, okay, this makes sense. You know, maybe they take care of like of Colquitt if they just choose to bring Colquitt back. Younghoe Koo, they have to decide whether or not they're. I would look at a tender. So, yeah, I mean, that's just kind of where it is. And I don't know. It's going to be interesting because for 4 guys, like I said, Koo is one of them, Patterson's another, and then it's Foye Oluokun and Russell Gage. Like those are the 4 guys that I'm really curious to see what happens with in free agency. And then I think everybody else, you kind of just figure it out as you go. Like an Eric Harris and a Deron Harmon. Do one of those guys maybe come back at a veteran minimum salary, and maybe they get that done in the next week if you want to, you know, lock up one of those guys. So there are other guys, but those 4 to me are the ones that are worth paying attention to next week in terms of, do the Falcons get a deal done before the tampering period starts at noon on Monday? Or next week, rather.
So we got more to talk about with Mike Rothstein here. Maybe we'll get some bold predictions on some moves that the Falcons may make to close out today's Locked On Falcons podcast. But we're talking about the combine, and why not combine your 2 favorite flavors? If one of those flavors is chocolate, if you like chocolate and mint, there's the Built Bar that tastes just like a candy bar. You can get mint brownie. If you like chocolate and cinnamon, there's churro puff. If you like chocolate and bananas, there's banana cream pie. Chocolate and peanut butter brownie. Chocolate and cherries, cherry barcia, coconut almond, chocolate. If you just love chocolate, you don't care about any other combination, you can get the double chocolate. All the flavors and more are available at built.com, and you want to try the latest flavors of Built Bar because Built Bar is the protein bar that tastes just like a candy bar, and it's not only tastes good, but it's good for you. It's low in sugar, it's low in calories, it's low in carbs, it's high in protein, high in fiber, and you can check out all the different flavors of Built Bars by heading over to built.com, and when you do, use the promo code LOCKED15 and you'll get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So, Mike, you just mentioned the 4 players, the 4 sort of priority free agents that the Falcons will have to get settled, in the next week or so before they potentially hit the market, including Cordarrelle Patterson, Younghoe Koo, Foye Oluokun, and Russell Gage. Any willingness to go out on a limb, this early in the process and, make a bet on which of these 4 guys, if all 4 of these guys will be back in Atlanta this year?
I think Koo returns. The only way at this point I would see that maybe that not happening is if they put a second. So let's just say they put a second round tender on Younghoe Koo, and a team actually gives them a second round, is willing to part with a second round pick for Koo. At that point, I think if you're the Falcons, as much as like a stable kicker and a kicker like Koo is very valuable, when you're building and having to do what you're doing with the Falcons, a second round pick might be more valuable, and you can figure out the kicker situation, like that would be to me the only way that Younghoe Koo doesn't come back at this point. But other than that, I don't know, man. I really don't. And I'm usually down to make predictions, but I think once we see some of the cap moves that are made, that might give us a better idea of what they're thinking and what might happen. Because if they all of a sudden need to end up creating, like, let's just say they create like $30 million in cap space by extensions, and let's just say they trade Calvin, right? Well, okay, are they going after somebody in free agency, or does that mean they're freeing up money to sign Foye and Gage? Because now all of a sudden, if Calvin's not there, Gage becomes kind of more important. He's not going to be a number 1 in your offense, but he becomes a higher value number 2 if he's not there. And then what do you do with Cordarrelle? If Ridley ends up staying and they don't trade Calvin Ridley, well, I don't know if you can afford Russell Gage, or you want to put a long-term investment in Russell Gage, because Calvin Ridley is going to be a 5th-year guy. And then at that point, you have to decide whether you want to give Ridley a long-term extension, or next year is going to be his last year, and then you let him go to free agency or franchise tag land. And if that happens, well, then you need to find a new number 1 receiver. And Russell Gage, I like Russell Gage as a player, but he is not a number one receiver. And I think most people would agree with that. Russell Gage might even agree with that, if you really ask them. So I think that so many of these pieces are maybe contingent on other things. Like, do they maybe see Deion Jones? And they've given no indication of this, right? But do they see Deion Jones maybe more in that middle linebacker role, and they want to move him back there? And if that happens, well, then you don't need Foye Oluokun as much. So there are just so many pieces that I think will be dictated by what we see the Falcons do, maybe to create cap space, and then maybe that tells us who they resign. I would imagine they go that route first, but who knows? Maybe they try to resign some guys first, and then go from there. It's they use the word puzzle. And it is, with some places, it is less of a puzzle and more of just like Jacksonville situation where they have a ton of cap room and you can just grab the guys. But in Atlanta, in places like New Orleans and Green Bay, it is truly a mix and match, figure out if here, then there puzzle where not every piece is going to make sense. Not every piece is going to look pretty, but it's going to be the pieces that you're going to have to work with. And I think the Falcons are hoping this is the last year they're in this situation. And I think they're going to be very, very cognizant and very, very careful to not put themselves in this situation again in 2023. But it's just the reality right now, Aaron. And I know that that's not a fun answer in terms of like predictions, but it's just, I think it's too murky at this point to really know.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I've been saying it all off season long. I don't really know what's going to happen. So anybody else's guess is as good as mine. So I'll take yours at that point. You mentioned they don't want to be in this situation in 2023. Is it fair to infer? Does that mean that they're more inclined to continue to sign guys to these 1-year contracts and figure it out later? Or do you see them being a little bit more willing to sign guys to maybe a couple of multi-year contracts like they did with Mike Davis last year?
I think it's going to depend on the player, right? And that's, by the way, that's the thing. Going back to Mike Davis, I think you can live with Mike Davis if you're the Falcons, if you know he's going to be your third down guy. Because like you said, he's good in pass pro. He can catch the ball out of the backfield. And he's been good in that role in the past. It was just clear when he was put in a main featured back role, it just wasn't him. I mean, that's the obvious thing that we saw last year. And maybe that changes with maybe improvements on the offensive line, maybe another year in the system, maybe a little bit more around him. Maybe that changes. But I can't see him being the number one guy. If he's back, I think it's a very specific role for him. And maybe it's that third down, 2-minute back guy, which is a very valuable position, by the way, and worth probably the money that they have invested in him at the moment. That said, I think that a lot of it will be 1-year deals again. Or if there is a player or two that intrigues them, maybe they go out on a 2 or 3 year limb. If it's a player that's a young player, that's an ascending player, that they're like, we're going to make this money not a lot in year 1 and kind of bloat it out in year 2 and 3. And, and maybe that money's not guaranteed. And you kind of go from there, which is what we see with a lot of contracts. But I think that you'll still see a lot of 1-year deals when it comes to the Falcons. I just don't think they're quite out of it yet. And I don't think they want to be in a situation where they're in it for a while. Plus, listen, there are many ways to build a football team, but I'm a big believer that if you're going to spend a lot of money in free agency, you are probably not going to win. Now, there are exceptions. New England made the playoffs last year, and they spent a lot in free agency. Tampa Bay, obviously, between Tom Brady and Ndamukong Suh. Some other players put a lot of money into free agency a couple of years back. Gronk. But on the whole, when you see a team spend a lot in free agency, that doesn't necessarily lead to success that next season or even the season after. So I'm always wary about that when it comes to free agency. So just understand that when you see guys on 1-year deals. I happen to like 1-year deals a lot, and it seems like that's the structure. The way that Terry Fontenot was talking when he used Cordarrelle Patterson as a perfect example, they're offering opportunity in Atlanta, is the way Terry Fontenot put it. And that's true based off the people that they have and frankly don't have currently on their roster for 2022. So the opportunity is there. And if you're a guy who wants to play on a 1-year prove-it deal, you can see what they did with Cordarrelle Patterson. You can arguably even say what they did with Foye Oluokun, even though he wasn't on a 1-year deal. But, I mean, Foye had his best year, I think, this past year. And you can say, okay, look, they did that with those guys. I can come here for 1 year, prove it, and then maybe go get paid elsewhere or paid in Atlanta. But and maybe next year they can pay those players. But this year, probably that pay would be elsewhere. So that's why I think that's a selling point they can do for guys. So it's why I think you won't see them all that active those first couple of days when you're seeing all this mega money thrown around. And then they try to be patient with guys that maybe think they could have gotten more than they did, or guys that thought they were going to get offers and ended up getting none. And then all of a sudden they're like, well, all right. I mean, that's kind of Daron Harmon last year. I mean, he played on the vet min, and Daron Harmon, I don't think has ever been a vet min player after his rookie deal. So, but what does that mean? So you look at some of that, and I think that's maybe the area where Terry Fontenot and Arthur Smith are going to play and see what they can do. And I think they did a decent job with it last year. Eric Harris, Cordarrelle, Daron Harmon started basically every game for them, whether you liked his play or not. So I think that they've shown they can do that. And that to me is where I think they're going to try and operate again here in the next month and a half.
Okay. All right. A lot of great insight from Mike there. And that will do it for us here, guys. Mike, go ahead and plug your stuff, plug the podcast, plug any articles that you're working on, what you got coming up.
Yeah. So podcast is From the Perch. We drop Mondays and Thursdays. If you listen to this past episode that dropped on Monday, Cordarrelle Patterson was on there. On Saturday, I had a story about Marquise Williams, the team's special teams coordinator run, which was a pretty emotional story for me to write, actually, because just of the subject matter. So without giving away too much of the story, please go read it on ESPN.com. Basically, his mom died in a very short time frame to him interviewing actually in Atlanta a year ago. And him and his family trusted me with their story. I'm very grateful for that because they didn't have to. And hopefully you read that story and take something from it. I lost my mom almost 8 years ago now. So whenever I'm writing about something like that, it hits home for me as well. So check that story out on ESPN.com. You can find me on the Twitter bird at Mike Rothstein, also on Instagram at Mike Rothstein, Facebook at Michael Rothstein Journalist. And like I said, the podcast is From the Perch. And of course, you can read me over at ESPN.com.
There you guys have it. Again, recommend checking out that Marquise Williams article. Very poignant article that he wrote this past Saturday. So guys, that will do it for us here on Locked On Falcons. I appreciate everybody for tuning in. If you want to get more insights into all the things going on at the Combine, of course, you can do so on the Locked On Podcast Network each and every day. You can check out the Locked On NFL podcast. You can check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast. All of those podcasts are free and available on the same podcast platforms that you can find Locked On Falcons. So guys, that will do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. Appreciate Mike for joining us and sharing his insight, and we'll see what happens over the next couple of days as the Falcons offseason unfolds. It's going to be interesting. I don't know if it's going to be active, but it's going to be interesting.